Clara Whitmore drove the last nail into her husband's coffin herself. Not because there was nobody left to do it. There were men standing right there in the yard, ranch hands, neighbors, the preacher from town who kept clearing his throat like he had something useful to say. They were all watching her, every single one of them. And not a single one of them moved. So Clara picked up the hammer. She drove that nail in clean and straight, the way Thomas had always taught her. One strike, two. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't tremble. The preacher finally stepped forward, and she looked at him with eyes so flat and certain that he stopped moving and looked down at his boots instead. The men behind him did the same. When it was done, Clara set the hammer down on the tailgate of the wagon, smoothed the front of her black dress with both hands, and said, "Thank you all for coming." That was it. That was all she gave them. Because the truth was, Clara Whitmore had stopped having anything left to give people who only showed up to watch her fail. She had married Thomas 8 years ago in the spring, when the territory was still wild enough that a man with enough nerve and a woman with enough sense could carve something real out of nothing. They had done exactly that. 240 acres of Montana grassland that had been hard ground and harder winters when they first broke soil on it, and was something worth fighting for by the time Thomas coughed his last breath into a handkerchief on a Tuesday morning in July of 1881. The ranch was called Whitmore Flats. The banknote on it was 4 months from calling due. Clara knew both of those facts the way she knew her own name. She also knew what the men gathered in her yard believed, that she would be sensible and sell, and move somewhere smaller, and let someone else carry what Thomas had left behind. She could see it in the careful, sympathetic way they looked at her. The way they didn't quite meet her eyes. The way Nathan Caldwell, who owned the biggest cattle operation in the county and had been trying to buy her land for 3 years, kept his hat in his hands and his face arranged into something that was supposed to look like grief, but looked more like patience. He was waiting. They were all waiting. Clara let them wait through the burial, through the 3 dishes of food that appeared on her porch afterward that she didn't touch through the long afternoon and the longer evening. She let them wait while she sat at Thomas's desk with his ledger open in front of her, and went through every number twice, and then a 3rd time, because the 3rd time confirmed what the first 2 had already told her. The ranch had 60 days, maybe 70, if she sold the 2 draft horses and cut the feed order in half. She sat with that information for a long time. Then she closed the ledger. Then she went to bed. And in the morning, before the sun was fully up, Clara Whitmore put on her black dress again, hitched the small sorrel mare to the wagon, and drove 14 miles to the Garrison County livestock auction. If you are watching this story right now, I want you to stop for just one moment and subscribe to this channel. Click that subscribe button and hit the bell so you never miss a story like this one. And when you leave a comment, tell me what city are you watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get back to Clara. The Garrison auction ran every Thursday from May through October, and it drew men from 4 counties who came to buy and sell horses, cattle, mules, and equipment. It was loud, and it smelled like hay and manure and leather, and the particular sharp sweat of working animals. And Clara had been there a dozen times over the years beside Thomas, who had a gift for reading livestock that she had spent 8 years quietly learning herself. She tied her mare at the post outside and walked through the gate. The conversations nearest to her stopped the way conversations do when something unexpected appears in a familiar place. A widow in full mourning at a livestock auction 2 days after her husband's burial was unexpected. Clara kept walking. She found a spot near the center rail where she could see the pen clearly, and she put her hands on the top board, and she watched. The first several lots moved through quickly. Good horses drew good money. A pair of matched bay geldings went for more than she had in the bank. A young quarter-horse stallion with clean legs and a bright eye brought a price that made the crowd murmur approvingly. She watched all of it, and she said nothing, and she moved to the next pen when it was time. It was the last pen that she had come for. She had heard about it 3 weeks ago, before Thomas died, from a man named Ira Foss, who ran the feed store in Garrison, and who had a habit of knowing things before they became common knowledge. He had told Thomas, and Thomas had told her. and she had filed it away in that part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. 7 horses, all rejected from a cavalry remount contract out of Fort Benton. The Army had wanted animals between 4 and 8 years old, sound in wind and limb trainable. Responsive, the kind of horse a soldier could ride into chaos and expect to come out the other side. These 7 had been evaluated and turned away. The evaluation notes, which Ira had somehow acquired a copy of, described them in terms that were not generous. Too aggressive. Unpredictable response to stimulus. History of injury. Excessive scarring. Poor response to standard training methodology. Not suitable for military application. Thomas had read those notes and gone quiet in the particular way he went quiet when something was working itself out behind his eyes. "Clara," he had said, "do you know what those words actually mean?" She had looked at the notes again. "They mean the horses fought back," she said. Thomas had smiled at her like she had just said something that made him proud. He was gone before Thursday came, but Clara remembered. The 7 horses came into the pen with the kind of energy that made the crowd step back from the rail. They were not a matched group, a big black stallion with a scar running jaw to chest. 2 mares that moved like they were reading every person in the space simultaneously. 3 geldings of varying age and color who held themselves with a wariness that was not fear exactly, but something more considered than fear, and 1 small dun mare who was older than the rest by a decade at least, and who walked into that pen and stood in the center of it like she owned it. The auctioneer looked at his notes, and looked at the horses, and looked at the crowd. "All right," he said with the tone of a man doing a chore he is not enthusiastic about. 7 head mixed lot, rejected remount stock. Offered as a group only. Who'll start me at 50? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Clara had expected this. She had also, in the small dark hours before dawn, thought carefully about what Thomas had believed about those horses, and why, and whether she believed it too, and whether belief was sufficient given the state of the ranch ledger. She had arrived at no clean conclusion. But she had arrived at the auction, and that was its own kind of answer. $10, she said. Every head in the place turned toward her. The auctioneer blinked. "Ma'am, I'm asking 50. I heard what you were asking," Clara said. "I'm offering 10. The man beside her, she didn't know him, a broad-shouldered rancher from up near the river by the look of his hat, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Lady, those horses aren't worth $10 apiece, let alone for the lot." "Then nobody else should have trouble letting me have them," Clara said. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither did anyone else at the rail. The auctioneer tried once more to generate interest. He described the horses with the optimistic vocabulary of his profession. He pointed out the stallion's deep chest and the older mare's solid bone structure. He noted that rejected remount stock often found successful second careers in working ranch operations. He was, Clara thought, doing his best. Nobody bid. She ended up with 7 horses for $12, because the auctioneer talked her up 2 more out of professional pride, and she paid the $12 in cash and presented the bill of sale to the gate attendant and led the horses out of the pen herself. This was the moment that Nathan Caldwell chose to appear. He had not been at the auction when she arrived. She had looked for him because she had learned years ago that Nathan Caldwell was the kind of man worth keeping track of. But he was here now, and he had clearly been told what had just happened, because his expression as he walked toward her had that particular quality of a man who believes he is arriving just in time to be helpful. Nathan Caldwell was 51 years old, and he had been ranching in this county since before it was a county. He was not an entirely bad man, which was perhaps the most complicated thing about him. He was capable of genuine generosity, and he had on more than one occasion extended credit to struggling neighbors in ways that had kept families on their land through hard winters. He was also absolutely certain in every cell of his considerable body that he understood how the world worked and what its correct order should be, and that certainty had a way of crowding out almost everything else. He had wanted Whitmore Flats for 3 years. The water rights attached to the eastern edge of Clara's property would solve a problem that had been costing him money since the drought of '78, and the acreage itself was some of the best grass in the county. He had made 3 offers to Thomas, each one reasonable, and each one declined. He had been waiting since then for circumstances to change. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and he said it gently, which was how she knew to be careful. "I heard what just happened in there. I want you to know, I have a great deal of respect for your nerve." "Thank you," Clara said. She was checking the lead ropes on the horses and not looking at him. "But I have to be honest with you," Nathan continued. "Those animals are not going to help you. I know you're in a difficult position right now, and I know Thomas wouldn't want—" "Nathan." She said his name quietly, and it stopped him. "Don't tell me what Thomas would want. You didn't know him half as well as you thought you did." Nathan's jaw tightened slightly, and then he made the visible effort to relax it. "I'm trying to help you." "I know you are," Clara said. She finally looked at him. "But the help I need isn't the kind you're offering. The banknote comes due in 4 months. I know when it comes due. If you sell now, you'll have enough to start over somewhere." "I'm not starting over," Clara said. "I'm not going somewhere smaller, and I'm not selling Thomas's land, and I'm not having this conversation again. So you can either wish me luck, or you can get out of my way, but I'd appreciate you deciding quickly because I need to get these horses home before dark." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the 7 horses behind her who were watching him with a collective attention that seemed to make him faintly uncomfortable. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Maybe," Clara said. "But it'll be my mistake." She drove home with 7 horses tied behind the wagon and $12 less in her pocket, and the clear and absolute knowledge that she had, in the space of 1 morning, made herself the subject of every conversation in Garrison County. She found that she could live with that. What she found harder to live with was the silence of the ranch without Thomas in it. She had been managing that silence for 2 days already, and she expected it to get worse before it got better, and she was right. The house had his smell still horses and pine soap, and the particular tobacco he kept in a tin on the mantelpiece, and she moved through it carefully, the way you move through a space where something delicate has broken, and you haven't yet had time to sweep up all the pieces. She put the horses in the south pasture where the fence was sound, and she watched them for an hour from the top rail. The black stallion, she was already thinking of him as Ranger, though she hadn't said the name out loud yet, moved around the perimeter of the pasture in a deliberate circuit, and she watched his eyes tracking the tree line and the fence posts and the distant ridge with a methodical attention that had nothing anxious in it. He wasn't nervous. He was assessing. The old dun mare Belle, she decided, because the name fit the way some names just do, had settled into the center of the pasture, and the other horses had organized themselves loosely around her, without any apparent discussion, as though the arrangement were simply obvious. Clara sat on that fence rail until the light went gold and then went gray, and the first stars appeared, and she thought about Thomas, and she thought about the ledger, and she thought about the horses, and she thought about what it meant that she was still sitting here instead of inside the house where the silence was waiting. Ranger came to the fence eventually. Not all the way. He stopped about 6 feet out and stood there, and she could hear him breathing slow and even. "I know," she said aloud to nobody, and to him, and to the dark, and maybe to Thomas, who had believed in this, and hadn't lived long enough to see whether he was right. "I know, but here we are." Ranger didn't move. He just stood there breathing. And Clara sat on the fence in the dark, and the silence of the ranch settled around her, and for the first time in 3 days, she did not feel entirely alone in it. She did not sleep well that night. The grief came at her in the dark, the way grief does when you've been too busy to give it room during the daylight, in waves sudden and total, and then receding and then returning. She lay in the bed that was too large now, and she let it come and go, and somewhere in the early hours before dawn, she came to a decision that had been forming since the auction yard, since the moment she'd looked at Nathan Caldwell, and said the words that needed saying. She was going to save this ranch. Not because she had to. Not because she had no other option, though the options were genuinely limited. But because Thomas had believed in this land, and these horses, and in her, and she was not willing to let all of that go without a fight. She got up before the sun and made coffee and went to the south pasture to check on the horses and found Ranger standing at the north corner of the fence, watching the ridge, and something in the way he was standing, the particular set of his attention, the stillness of it made her stop walking and look at the ridge herself. She didn't see anything, but she felt something, the way you feel weather before it arrives, the way you feel a thing before you have the language for it. She looked at Ranger for a long moment. "What do you know?" she asked him. He didn't answer. But he didn't look away from the ridge either, and she stood there with him in the early morning quiet, and the coffee going cold in her hand, and the feeling sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't yet name. The trouble came the following week in the form of a man named Doyle, who worked for Nathan Caldwell, and made a point of riding past the south fence on Tuesday morning while Clara was repairing a section of board. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Doyle said. He had a way of saying her name that made it sound like a verdict. "Those the famous horses I've been hearing about?" "They're horses," Clara said without looking up from the fence. "Heard you paid $12 for the lot." He let the pause do its work. $12 for 7 head the Army threw out. That's something." "It is," Clara agreed. "Mr. Caldwell was asking about your plans," Doyle said. "For the ranch, whether you'd be taking on any help." Clara straightened and looked at him. "Tell Mr. Caldwell my plans are my own business, and tell him I don't need that kind of help." Doyle tipped his hat in a way that was not a gesture of respect. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and rode on. She watched him go, and then turned back to the fence and drove the nail harder than she needed to. 3 days after that, the feed store in town declined to extend her credit. She had been buying feed on a running account for 6 years without a single missed payment, and the owner, a man named Pitts, who had attended Thomas's burial and shaken her hand and said whatever was needed was his to give, told her with elaborate and entirely unconvincing regret that circumstances had changed. He couldn't say why. He seemed genuinely embarrassed. Clara paid what she owed in cash and walked out and drove home and sat in the kitchen for a long time doing arithmetic in her head. Someone had gotten to Pitts. She knew who. The week after that, a young man appeared at her gate on a horse that had been ridden hard from a distance, and he introduced himself as Ethan Walker, and he said he was looking for work. Clara looked at him. He was maybe 30, lean and sun-darkened, with the kind of hands that had spent years working with horses, and he held himself with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that moving too quickly in certain situations was a mistake. His eyes went to the south pasture before they came back to her, and she watched what happened in them when they found the horses. He went quiet. Not the quiet of indifference, the quiet of recognition. "Where'd you come from?" Clara asked. "Fort Benton most recent," he said. "Before that cavalry. Before that it's a long story." "Why are you here?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I heard a woman in Garrison County bought 7 horses the Army threw out, and I wanted to see if it was true. And if it was true, I wanted to see what she planned to do with them." Clara studied him for a moment. "Those horses aren't easy." "I know what they are," Ethan said. "I was at Fort Benton when they came through for evaluation. I read the rejection notes. I didn't agree with them." He paused. "I said so at the time. It didn't go over well." "What do you think they are?" Clara asked. He looked at the pasture again. Ranger was watching them from near the center fence line, ears forward, absolutely still. "I think they're the kind of horses that don't survive easy circumstances," Ethan said slowly. "I think whatever they've been through made them into something the Army's standard evaluation wasn't built to measure. And I think if somebody worked with them right, worked with what they already are, instead of trying to make them into something else, they'd be more useful than any 10 broke horses that never had to be." He brought his eyes back to her. "But that's just what I think." "You asked." Clara looked at him for another long moment. "I can't pay much," she said. "I'm not asking for much," he said. "The work is hard." "I know what hard work looks like." "The neighbors think I've lost my mind." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close to one. "Respectfully, Mrs. Whitmore, the neighbors might not be the most reliable measure of what's sensible. Clara looked at him and at the pasture and at Ranger standing there watching, and she thought about Thomas, who had believed in things that couldn't always be explained until after you'd lived through them. "You can put your horse in the east barn," she said. "Supper's at 6. We'll talk about the horses tomorrow." Ethan Walker nodded once, the way a man nods when the thing he was hoping for has happened, and he doesn't want to press his luck by saying so out loud. He rode toward the east barn, and Clara watched him go, and then she looked at Ranger, who had gone back to watching the ridge. She didn't know yet what was building out there. She didn't have the language for it yet, the shape of it. But standing in the yard of her ranch with the late afternoon light lying flat across the grass, she felt it the way she had felt it that first morning. The weight of something coming. The particular pressure of a thing that has not yet arrived, but is already in motion. She went inside and started supper, and she was still thinking about that ridge when the sun went down and the dark came up, and somewhere in the distance, carried on the night wind from the north, she heard the first long cry of a coyote, and then another, and then more than she could count, rising together into something that sounded less like animals calling and more like something with intent behind it. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time listening. In the south pasture, Ranger stood at the north fence and did not move. And Clara Whitmore, who had not cried once since Thomas died, pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window and made herself a promise that she intended to keep. Ethan Walker was not a man who wasted words in the morning. Clara had noticed that within the first 2 days. He rose before she did, which she discovered only because she had the habit of being up before the sun, and she came out to find the east barn already open, and Ethan already inside moving between the stalls with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that horses respond better to calm than to energy. He didn't whistle. He didn't talk to himself. He worked in a silence that felt somehow inhabited rather than empty. She stood in the barn doorway that second morning with 2 cups of coffee and watched him check the leg wrapping on one of the geldings, a raw-boned gray she had started calling Ghost because of the way he appeared and disappeared in low light, and she noticed that his hands moved the way Thomas's hands had moved around animals. Slow, deliberate, with a patience that had nothing passive in it. "He let you do that?" she asked. Ethan didn't look up. He objected for the first 5 minutes. Then he decided it wasn't worth the argument. She held out one of the cups. He came to the doorway and took it, and they stood there in the early quiet, looking toward the south pasture, where the others were beginning to move as the light came up. "The stallion watched the north fence all night," Ethan said. "I know," Clara said. "I checked at 2 in the morning. He looked at her sideways. "So did I." They were quiet for a moment, both of them, with their eyes on Ranger, who was standing at the north fence right now in the full morning light, doing exactly what he'd been doing in the dark. "Something's up there," Ethan said. "Yes," Clara said. "How long has he been doing that?" "Since the first night I brought him home." Ethan turned his cup in his hands slowly. The cavalry evaluation team noted that 3 of these horses showed what they called excessive alertness to environmental stimulus, he said. It was in the rejection notes. They counted it as a fault. Clara looked at Ranger. "Excessive alertness," she said flatly. "Yes, ma'am." "A horse that watches a ridgeline and doesn't stop watching it until he knows what's there," she said. They counted that as a fault. They were looking for horses that would stay calm in structured chaos, Ethan said. Marching formations, cannon fire flag movements, controlled conditions. They didn't want horses that were always thinking. "But we're not in a formation," Clara said. "No," Ethan agreed. "We're not." She finished her coffee and handed him the empty cup and went to start the day's work. And behind her she heard him go back into the barn and begin again, slow and quiet, the same as before. The rhythm of the ranch reasserted itself over the following days with a stubbornness that Clara found both steadying and heartbreaking, because the rhythm was Thomas's, and he was not there to keep it, and she had to keep it herself or let it fall apart. She kept it. She made the decisions that needed making and did the work that needed doing, and she let herself feel what she felt in small measured doses at night alone. when there was nobody watching and nothing left that required her to be entirely functional. The horses were the part that held her together more than she expected. She had not anticipated that. She had bought them with a combination of grief-sharpened instinct and the memory of Thomas's voice telling her that sometimes the things people throw away are exactly the things that save you. She had not expected to find herself at the end of a long and draining day, leaning on the south pasture fence watching them move and feeling something in her chest loosen that had been tight since Tuesday morning when Thomas stopped breathing. Ethan was training them. Not breaking them, he had made that distinction on the second morning when she asked how he planned to approach it, and the distinction had told her something important about him. "I'm not going to break anything," he said. "Breaking a horse means taking something out of them. What these horses have in them is the whole point. I'm going to work with it." "How?" Clara asked. He had thought about that for a moment, which she also appreciated the fact that he took the question seriously instead of reaching for an easy answer. "They already have a herd structure," he said finally. "You can see it. The dun mare is the center. The stallion is the perimeter. The others know their places without being told. So I'm going to start by convincing them that I'm part of the structure, not a threat to it." "And how long does that take?" The almost smile again. "As long as it takes Mrs. Whitmore." She had told him to call her Clara. He had nodded and continued to call her Mrs. Whitmore, and she had decided not to fight about it. The method worked, which she could see even in the first week. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have impressed anyone watching from outside, but the horses that had been watchful and edged in their first days on the ranch began gradually to carry themselves differently around Ethan, not relaxed exactly, but something more like acknowledged, like they had agreed to include him in the accounting of what was safe. Ranger was the last to shift, and when he did, Clara happened to be watching. It was a Thursday afternoon 9 days after Ethan had arrived. He was standing in the south pasture about 20 feet from the stallion, doing nothing in particular, just standing there, weight on both feet, eyes down, not pressing. He had been standing like that for the better part of an hour. Clara had checked twice, and both times he was in the same position, and she had concluded that he either had enormous patience or his mind was somewhere else entirely. Then Ranger took 3 steps toward him, stopped, took 2 more, put his nose against Ethan's shoulder, and stood there. Ethan didn't move, didn't reach up to touch him, just stayed completely still and let it happen. Clara turned away from the fence because there was something about the moment that felt private, and also because her eyes were doing something she preferred not to explain. She went to the house and started on supper, and told herself that this did not mean anything in terms of the banknote or the feed costs or Nathan Caldwell's patience wearing thin. It was a horse touching a man's shoulder. It was not a solution, but it felt like the beginning of one, and that was a thing she was learning to hold carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you're not sure yet will last. The letter from the bank arrived on a Friday. She had been expecting it, so the envelope didn't frighten her, but she sat with it on the kitchen table for a full minute before she opened it. The letter was polite in the way that legal documents are polite when they are delivering information that is not optional. It confirmed the terms of the note, confirmed the date of maturity, and noted that the bank would welcome a conversation about the property in the event that repayment proved difficult to arrange. The bank manager's name was Aldous Hitch, and Clara had known him since she was a girl, and she knew that the careful phrasing of that last sentence was his work, because Aldous Hitch was constitutionally incapable of saying an unkind thing directly. He would wrap it in civility until it was almost unrecognizable, and you had to unwrap it carefully to find what it actually meant. What it meant was, "We are preparing for you to fail." Clara read the letter twice, folded it, put it in the tin box where she kept documents, and went outside. Ethan was at the fence. He had seen her come out, and he had read something in the way she was moving, because by the time she reached him, he had already turned away from the horses to face her. "Bank letter," she said before he could ask. He nodded once. 4 months, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Tell me what you know about the Coyote problem." She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that had not been among them. "What? "The Coyotes," he said. "Up in the territory. I heard things at Fort Benton before I left, and I've heard more since I've been here. Tell me what you know." She leaned on the fence beside him and looked at the pasture and thought about it. "It started last spring," she said. "Up north, near the river. Packs coming in larger than usual, more coordinated than usual. Ranchers losing calves, some full-grown cattle. Anderson up near the county line lost 11 head in 6 weeks. The Morrison family had to bring their entire herd in at night, and they still lost 3. "How far south has it come?" "Not here yet," Clara said. "But people are talking. 3 ranches between here and the Morrison place have had night attacks in the past 2 months. She paused. Nobody has a good answer for it. Some men are talking about hiring shooters. Other men tried setting traps, but the packs are too smart, they go around them. Ethan was quiet, looking at the horses. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked. "I'm thinking about why the Army's standard response to predator intrusion doesn't work," he said. "Which is the same reason the standard response to these horses didn't work. You go in with a fixed method and you expect everything else to conform to it. But the coyotes aren't conforming. And these horses..." He stopped and started again. "I've seen horses used as livestock protection before, not trained for it the way you'd train a dog. But horses that had the instinct for it, that had learned through hard experience how to manage threats to a herd. It works different from anything else. It works because the horses think." Clara was very still. "You think that's what these horses are?" she said. "I think it's a strong possibility," Ethan said carefully. "I don't want to promise you something I can't deliver. But I think the instincts are there. I think the structure is there. Belle's the key, the way the others organize around her, the way they read her. If she decides the herd needs protecting, they'll follow her lead. And Ranger." He stopped, looking at the stallion at the north fence. "Ranger doesn't sleep, not really. He rests standing up and he watches." "You think the Army called that excessive alertness?" "They did," Clara said. "What they had," Ethan said quietly, "was a horse that had appointed himself responsible for something. And they didn't want the responsibility. They wanted the performance." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "How long to know for certain?" she asked. "A few more weeks of work," Ethan said. "Maybe less. The structure's already there. I'm mostly just learning to read it." She nodded slowly. Then, "Nathan Caldwell came by while you were in the north pasture this morning." The stillness that came over Ethan then was different from his usual stillness, more deliberate. "What did he want?" "He wanted to know if I'd reconsidered selling," Clara said. "He had an updated offer. He was very polite about it." "What did you tell him?" "I told him no." She paused. "He stayed friendly. He said he understood. He said the offer would remain open as long as I needed. He said..." She stopped, because what Nathan had said next was the part that was still sitting in her, like something she hadn't fully digested. "He said he hoped I knew that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do for themselves is recognize when they're fighting a battle they can't win." Ethan turned to look at her directly. "He said that," Ethan said. "He said it gently," Clara said. "He's always gentle." "That's not kindness," Ethan said. "That's patience. He's waiting for you to run out of options." "I know what he's doing." "Does he know you know?" Clara thought about Nathan's careful, sympathetic eyes, and the particular quality of his waiting. "I think he suspects," she said. "I don't think he cares." Ethan turned back to the horses. "Then we'd better give him something to care about," he said. The thing he meant by that became clearer over the following 2 weeks as the training shifted from the slow, foundational work of trust building into something with more shape to it. Ethan began working the horses together, moving them as a group, and what Clara watched from the fence during those sessions was so different from anything she had seen before that she found herself going still and quiet in the way she went still and quiet when something was working itself out that she didn't have words for yet. The horses moved like they were thinking collectively. Belle set the direction and the pace, and the others organized around her with a precision that had no performance in it, no showmanship, no effort to impress. It was purely functional, which made it more striking than any trained display she had ever watched. When Ethan introduced a simulated threat from the east fence noise movement pressure, the response was immediate and coordinated. The smaller animals went to Bell. Ranger went to the threat. The others formed a moving perimeter between the two. "They've done this before," she said to Ethan that evening. "Yes," he agreed. "Where when the army had them before that?" "Before the army," Ethan said, "those horses came from 3 different places. I tracked back the acquisition records at Fort Benton before I left. 2 of the mares came from a Crow trading post up near the Yellowstone. The geldings came from a settlement ranch that broke up in '78 when the family lost everything to a harsh winter. And Ranger—" He paused. Ranger's history was listed as unknown, which usually means someone knew and didn't want to say. Clara looked at him. "What do you think it means?" "I think it means he came from somewhere that the army didn't want to acknowledge as a source," Ethan said carefully. There were horse handlers among certain tribal groups in the territory who trained animals in ways that didn't match cavalry methodology at all. The army took horses from those places when it was convenient and didn't always record where they'd come from. What those horses knew what they'd been taught, it didn't show up in a standard evaluation because it wasn't being looked for. Clara sat with that for a long time. "Thomas knew," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "What did he tell you about them?" "He said people judge what they don't understand," she said. "He said sometimes the thing everyone throws away is the thing that saves you." She was quiet. "He never explained more than that, but I think he understood where they came from and what they carried." Ethan nodded, looking at the pasture. He understood more than most. The night the first attack came was a Wednesday 3 weeks and 2 days after Ethan had arrived at Whitmore Flats. Clara woke at 11:30 to a sound she had never heard before, or rather to the absence of a sound she had gotten used to. She had grown accustomed to Ranger's movement along the north fence, the occasional soft sound of his progress, the way she could hear him in her sleep without waking. When that sound stopped, the silence woke her. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully conscious of having moved. The south pasture was lit by a half moon, enough light to see shapes but not detail, and what she saw made her breath come short. The horses were in formation. All 7 of them moving with a purpose and coordination she had watched in daylight but had not seen in the dark. And it was different in the dark, more urgent, more absolute. The way things become more themselves when the softening light is gone. She pulled on boots and a coat and took the rifle from beside the door and went outside, and she heard them before she reached the pasture fence. Heard the coyotes more than she had ever heard. At one time, a sound that came from multiple directions simultaneously, that rose and fell and rose again, with an intelligence in it that went beyond what she had always thought of as animal. She stood at the fence and watched. The horses held a line, Ranger at the front, Bell behind him and slightly to the right, the others arranged in a curve that enclosed the space the livestock had been pressed into, and the coyotes tested the line again and again. She could see them in the moonlight, lean shapes that approached and retreated and approached again, looking for the break that was not there. Ethan appeared beside her without a word. He had the other rifle. He looked at the horses and at the coyotes, and he stood very still. "Don't shoot yet," he said quietly. "I wasn't going to," Clara said. They watched together. The testing went on for what felt much longer than the 20 minutes she counted on the clock later. The coyotes were patient and organized, and if she hadn't known better, she would have said they were thinking. But the horses were more patient, and whatever the horses were doing, it was working because the livestock, her cattle, her 3 remaining draft horses in the adjacent pen, were still and quiet, in a way that made no sense unless they understood they were being protected. Finally, the coyotes withdrew. Not in panic, not driven away, they simply stopped pressing and pulled back, and the night went quiet in the particular way it goes quiet when a threat has passed rather than been eliminated. Clara let out a breath she had been holding for a long time. "That was the first wave," Ethan said beside her. She looked at him. "You think they'll come back?" "Not tonight," he said. But yes, they'll come back. He paused. And the next time, there will be more of them. She stood at the fence in the cold night air and looked at her horses, who were already beginning to relax out of the formation, not dispersing, just shifting the way soldiers stand down, but don't disarm. Ranger had come back to the north fence. Belle had settled, and the others were near her. And Clara understood standing there that what she had bought at that auction for $12 was not 7 rejected horses. She had bought something that nobody in this county had the language for yet. Something that the cavalry had seen and not recognized and turned away. Something that Thomas had understood, and she had half understood, and Ethan had arrived to help her understand the rest of. She had bought 7 animals who had been through enough that ordinary threats no longer moved them, who had organized themselves around something worth protecting and refused to abandon the organization under pressure. She had, without knowing exactly what she was doing, bought the most capable livestock protection she had ever seen or heard of from a man who'd been dead a week and had spent 8 years quietly leaving her the tools she would need when he was gone. She pressed her hand flat on the top fence board, and she didn't say anything for a long time. "Clara," Ethan said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard there before. She looked at him. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why I actually came here." She waited. "Nathan Caldwell came to Fort Benton 2 months ago," Ethan said. "He was talking to people, to anyone who'd listen, about a widow ranch up in Garrison County that was going to come available soon. He was lining up buyers, investors. He had it worked out that by the time the banknote came due, you'd have no options left, and no credit and no way out. He had the feed store sewn up before I left Fort Benton." He stopped. "I didn't know you then. I just heard a man making very certain arrangements about someone who hadn't agreed to be arranged, and it bothered me. So I rode south to see for myself." Clara looked at him in the moonlight. "He's been planning this since before Thomas died," she said. It was not a question. The knowledge settled into her like cold water, and she let it settle because she needed to feel the full shape of it before she decided how to respond. "He may have been waiting for Thomas to die," Ethan said carefully. "Or he may have been preparing for the possibility. I can't tell you which." "It doesn't matter which," Clara said. "No," Ethan agreed. "It doesn't." She looked at Ranger standing at the north fence watching. "He made a mistake," she said. "Did he?" "He didn't account for the horses," she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly he said, "No, he didn't." The cold had settled fully by then, and the half-moon had moved west, and somewhere in the distance, the coyotes had gone back to wherever coyotes go when they decide to wait. Clara stood at the fence and thought about Nathan Caldwell at Fort Benton 2 months ago, making careful arrangements, and she thought about Thomas, who had told her the last spring of his life that there were men in this world who did their worst damage with a smile and a reasonable voice, and that the only answer to that kind of damage was to build something they couldn't take. She had bought those horses with the last $12 she had because she'd felt Thomas's certainty in her chest like her own heartbeat. Now she understood what she had to build. "How long," she said, "before the coyote problem reaches every ranch in this county?" Ethan thought about it seriously. "Another month," he said. "Maybe 6 weeks." "And how long before my horses are ready for what comes next?" "They're ready now," he said. "I've been working toward what they already were. That was always the work." Clara pushed off the fence and turned toward the house. "Then we have 6 weeks," she said, "to make sure every rancher in Garrison County knows what these horses can do. Because when Nathan Caldwell's timeline runs out and he comes for this ranch, I want witnesses who have seen with their own eyes what he's trying to take." She went inside. Behind her, Ethan stood at the fence in the dark, and Ranger watched the ridge, and the cold settled over Whitmore Flats with the patience of things that are still waiting. The 6 weeks Clara had given herself turned into 4. Not because she had miscalculated. Because Nathan Caldwell had. He had expected her to stay quiet. To keep her head down, manage her crisis in private, and let the slow pressure of debt and isolation do what direct confrontation couldn't. That was the plan she could read between the lines of everything he had done since Thomas's burial. The feed store, the bank letter's careful language, Doyle riding past the fence with that verdict smile. Patient, methodical, invisible. The kind of damage that looks like bad luck until it's too late to fight it. What he had not planned for was the Heller Ranch. The Heller place sat 11 miles northeast of Whitmore Flats on the same ridge system that Ranger had been watching since the first night. Frank Heller was 63 years old, had been ranching that ground since before Montana was a territory, and had the particular stubbornness of a man who had outlasted everything the land had thrown at him and considered stubbornness a virtue rather than a flaw. Clara had known him since childhood. He had come to Thomas's burial, stood in the back, said nothing, and left before the food came out. That was Frank Heller's version of grief, and she understood it because it was close to her own. He came to Whitmore Flats on a Tuesday morning, 4 weeks after Ethan had arrived, and he came on foot, which told her something had happened to at least one of his horses before she even had the gate open. "Frank," she said. "Clara." He took his hat off, which was the Heller version of urgency. "I need to talk to you about something I heard." She brought him inside and put coffee in front of him and waited. "People are talking," he said, "about what happened at your south pasture 3 weeks ago. The Coyote pack, the horses." He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her. "I need to know if what they're saying is true." "What are they saying?" "They're saying those horses held a line," he said. 7 horses, and they held a line against a pack that should have broken them. They're saying the livestock didn't scatter. They're saying the horses knew what they were doing." "It's true," Clara said. Frank Heller was quiet for a moment. He had the kind of face that didn't move much when he was thinking, and she had learned as a child that the stillness meant he was taking something seriously, not dismissing it. "I lost 4 calves last week," he said. 3 nights in a row. I've got men watching, but the pack comes in from 2 sides at once, and by the time we get to one end, they've already hit the other." He paused. "I've set traps. I've had shooters out. I've tried everything a man is supposed to try, and it isn't working, Clara, and I'm not the only one. Anderson lost 6 head last month. The Birch Creek outfit had a mare killed 2 nights ago." He looked at her steadily. "Whatever those horses of yours are doing, I need to understand it." Clara looked at him. She thought about the 6 weeks she had planned the slow building of witnesses, the strategy she had outlined to Ethan in the cold by the south fence. Then she thought about Frank Heller coming 11 miles on foot because something had gone wrong with his horses. "Come outside," she said. She took him to the south pasture and let him watch Ethan work the horses for 40 minutes. She didn't explain anything while it was happening. She let him see it. When it was done, Frank stood at the fence for a long time without speaking. "Lord Almighty," he said finally. "Yes," Clara said. "That old mare," he said. "She's the center of it." "Belle," Clara said. "Yes." "And the stallion." "Ranger, he runs the perimeter. When there's a threat, he goes to it. The others fill in behind Belle and hold the protected space." Frank turned to look at her. "Where did you learn this?" "I didn't learn it," Clara said. "I bought it. For $12 at the Garrison auction." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not seen Frank Heller do in 20 years of knowing him. He laughed. Not unkindly, it was the laugh of a man who has just understood a joke that was also true. "Nathan Caldwell called you crazy," he said. "Most of the county called me crazy," Clara said. "Most of the county was wrong," Frank said. He turned back to the horses. "What do you need to make this work to bring them to my ranch work with my livestock?" Clara had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully because she needed it to work, and she needed it to be honest, and she needed it to be something she could stand behind when Nathan Caldwell eventually used it against her, which she was certain he would try. "I need 3 nights," she said. "I need access to your pasture and your herd. I need your men to follow Ethan's instructions exactly, even if they don't understand why. And I need you to be willing to tell people what you see." Frank didn't hesitate. "Done," he said. They went to the Heller Ranch that Thursday. The first night was quiet. The Coyote pack tested the perimeter twice, but didn't commit to a full press, and Clara stood in the dark beside Ethan and watched the horses move in the unfamiliar space with the same calm purpose they showed on home ground. Ranger had taken less than an hour to map the boundaries. Bell had the Heller cattle organized in a tighter formation than Frank's men had ever managed, and Frank stood at the fence next to Clara, with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who is revising a fundamental belief about what is possible. "They don't know this land," he said quietly. "No," Ethan said, "but they know threat, and they know herd. The specific geography doesn't change the calculus much." "Where did you learn to work horses this way?" Frank asked. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "From people who weren't in the habit of writing things down," he said. "Which is why nobody else knows it." Frank looked at him, and then looked back at the pasture and let it go. The second night the pack came in force. Clara counted at least 30 animals coming from the northeast in 2 separate columns that converged at the south fence line, the same coordinated approach that had broken other ranchers' defenses, because it split the human response and created confusion. She felt Frank's men tense around her, felt the instinct to call for rifles and lanterns and organized response. "Hold," Ethan said quietly, and his voice had that particular quality that made people listen without knowing why. Everyone held. The horses had already responded. The shift in their formation happened before the coyotes were fully visible, a ripple that moved through the group from Ranger outward, a tightening, a redefinition of the protected space, and Bell moving through the cattle with a steadiness that transferred to them physically, a visible settling of the herd that Clara wouldn't have believed if she hadn't seen it happen before. Ranger hit the fence line and stopped there, and the message he transmitted to the approaching pack was not aggression. It was something older and more absolute than aggression. It was certainty. The certainty of an animal that has decided this is where the line is and has made its peace with what that decision means. The pack tested for 40 minutes. Then they left. Frank Heller lost no cattle that night. By the time the third night had passed without incident, there were 6 men from neighboring ranches standing at Frank's fence who had ridden over because word had traveled the way word travels in ranch country fast, and with the particular credibility of information that comes from someone you've trusted for 20 years. Clara stood in the middle of those 6 men and answered questions until the sun came up. She drove home that morning with something she hadn't had since Thomas died. Not hope exactly she'd had that in smaller doses throughout. This was something more solid. This was momentum, and she could feel the difference in her chest. Ethan was quiet on the drive back. He had a way of going internal after big nights, and she had learned not to push it. "It worked," she said when the Whitmore gate was in sight. "It worked," he agreed. "More ranchers will come now." "Yes." She glanced at him. "Say what you're thinking." He was quiet for another moment, and then he said, "I'm thinking that Nathan Caldwell has someone at the Heller place. One of the hands, maybe, or someone Frank trusts. Word of what we just did will reach Caldwell by this afternoon." Clara had thought about this too. And he won't wait as long as he planned to," Ethan said. "We moved his timeline. He'll move his." She felt the weight of that settle. "How long do we have?" she asked. "I don't know," he said, "but I'd guess he makes a move within the week." He was right by 2 days. The letter arrived Friday, not from the bank this time, from the county land office. It was formal and precise and written in the language of legal process which Clara had to read 3 times before the shape of it became clear to her. A claim had been filed against the eastern water rights attached to Whitmore Flats. The claim alleged that a surveying error made in 1873 had placed the boundary line incorrectly, and that the water rights Clara held were in fact attached to the property to the north, which was to say, to Nathan Caldwell's land. She sat at Thomas's desk with the letter in her hands for a very long time. Then she got up and went to find Ethan. He read it standing in the barn doorway, and the expression that moved across his face was not surprise. It was the expression of a man who has been waiting for the other boot to drop and has now heard it. "He's been planning this longer than Fort Benton," Ethan said. "I know." "This kind of survey challenge takes months to set up," he said. "The documentation, the legal filing, finding someone willing to reinterpret a boundary line from 8 years ago." "He was planning it before Thomas got sick," Clara said. The words sat in the air between them. Ethan folded the letter very carefully. "Do you have a lawyer?" "I have a man in garrison who handles documents," Clara said. "I don't know if he handles this." "He may not need to," Ethan said. "Do you have the original survey records?" She looked at him. Thomas kept everything. Every paper, every document. He had a box. She went to the house and came back 20 minutes later with a tin box she'd carried from Thomas's study, and they sat at the kitchen table and went through it together. Thomas had been among his other qualities meticulous. The survey records were there. The original boundary documentation from 1873 was there. The deed of transfer when Thomas had bought the eastern acreage in 1876 was there with a boundary description so specific it included the names of the landmarks used to establish the line. Ethan spread it all on the table and read it with the focused attention of a man who has learned to read important things carefully because the details are where the truth lives. "This is solid," he said finally. "Is it enough?" "It should be more than enough," he said, "if it gets in front of someone honest." "Nathan Caldwell has friends in the county land office," Clara said. "I know," Ethan said, "which means we don't win this at the county level." He paused. "Do you know anyone at the territorial level? Someone Thomas knew? Maybe someone above the county?" Clara thought about it. She thought about the men Thomas had known, the relationships he'd built over 8 years of ranching, the people who had come through and stayed and corresponded. And then she thought of a name. "Samuel Grant," she said. Ethan looked up. "He's a territorial livestock inspector," Clara said. "He and Thomas went back years. He came through here twice on inspection tours and stayed 2 nights each time. He's based in Helena." She paused. "He's honest." "Write to him," Ethan said. "Tonight. Send everything with a courier tomorrow morning. Don't go through the county post." She nodded and then said, "Ethan, if the water rights go, they won't," he said. And there was something in his voice that was not reassurance in the empty sense. It was the voice of someone who has looked at the evidence and reached a conclusion and is stating it as fact. She held on to that. The following Tuesday, Nathan Caldwell came to Whitmore Flats himself. He came in the middle of the afternoon, which was deliberate. Afternoon meant she was most likely to be alone in the house, with the hands out on the property, and Ethan wherever Ethan was. He came in a good wagon with his good horse, and he came alone, which was also deliberate, because Nathan Caldwell was most effective when it was just him and the person he was talking to. No witnesses, no friction. Clara saw him coming from the kitchen window, and she took off her apron and went to the porch and stood there waiting with her hands at her sides. He pulled up and got down and came to the porch with his hat in his hands, and that expression of careful sympathy that she had learned to read as the mask it was. "Clara," he said. "Nathan," she said. "I heard about what happened at Frank Heller's place," he said. "I want you to know I think what you did was remarkable. Genuinely. Those horses, what they did, people are talking about it all over the county." "I know," Clara said. "But I need to talk to you about something difficult," he said. "About the water rights situation." "I received the filing," she said. Nathan nodded with the sorrow of a man delivering news he wishes he didn't have to deliver. "I want you to know I didn't initiate that," he said. "The survey discrepancy was flagged by the county assessor's office during a routine review. My name came into it only because my land is adjacent." Clara looked at him. "Nathan," she said, "I've known you for 20 years." He waited. "I know you didn't tell the county assessor to look at my survey," she said. "I know you paid someone to look at my survey and told them what to find, and then had the county assessor told about what they found. That's how this works, and we both know it. So let's not stand here and discuss it as though it were an act of God." The sympathy left Nathan Caldwell's face for approximately 3 seconds. That was all it took, 3 seconds of a different expression, something flatter and harder and much more honest than anything she had seen from him before. Then the sympathy came back, but it was different now, less careful. "You're in a difficult position," he said. "I've been in a difficult position since July," Clara said. "I'm still here." Clara. He stepped forward slightly, and his voice dropped in that way that was meant to feel like confidence, like the two of them sharing something private. "I'm going to be direct with you because I respect you. The water rights challenge is going to be difficult for you to fight at the county level. You don't have the resources for a prolonged legal battle, and your banknote comes due in 3 months." He paused to let that settle. "I have a new offer, better than the last. Enough to pay the note, enough for you to start over somewhere with room to breathe. You could take those horses with you. I'm not interested in the horses. I'm interested in the land, and I'm being fair about the price." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You came here to tell me I can't win," she said. "I came here to offer you a way out that doesn't end in loss," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" she said. "Clara, my answer is no," she said. "It's going to be no next week too, and the week after. You can come back as many times as you like. You'll get the same answer." Nathan looked at her, and she saw something shift in him, a decision being made, a patience expiring. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I expect I am," Clara said. He put his hat back on. He went to his wagon. He climbed up and gathered the reins and looked back at her from the seat. "I'm sorry about Thomas," he said, and for the first time since the burial, she thought he might actually mean it. "He was a good man." "He was," Clara said. "He was also right about the horses. So was I." Nathan Caldwell drove away. She stood on the porch until the wagon was out of sight, and then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and for about 5 minutes she let herself feel how scared she was. She let it come fully, let it be as large as it actually was, the banknote and the water rights and Nathan's expiring patience and the coyotes and the whole weight of it pressing down on her at once. Then she got up and put the kettle on. When Ethan came in an hour later and saw her face, he stopped in the doorway. "He came," Ethan said. "He came," she said. "Sit down. I need to tell you what he said, and then I need to tell you what I noticed while he was saying it." Ethan sat. She told him the conversation precisely as she had committed it to memory the moment it ended. Ethan listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him that she had come to rely on, the listening that was actual listening, not waiting. When she finished, he said, "What did you notice?" "He said he's not interested in the horses," Clara said. "He said I could take them with me." Ethan was still. "He's not afraid of the horses," she said. "He doesn't think they matter. He's seen what they can do at the Heller Ranch, and he still doesn't think they're the point." "Because he doesn't understand what they mean yet," Ethan said slowly. "Not yet," Clara said. "But Nathan Caldwell is not a stupid man. Give him another 2 weeks, another 3 ranchers coming to us with coyote problems, and he'll understand exactly what this is. He'll understand that I'm not just saving my ranch. I'm changing how every rancher in this county thinks about livestock protection. And if I do that—" "He loses more than your land," Ethan said. "He loses the position. He's built his whole reputation on knowing the right method," Clara said. "On expensive cattle operations and the right way to run them, and the money to do it his way. If a widow with $12 and 7 rejected horses builds something that works better, that's not just a financial loss for him. It's everything," Ethan said. "Yes," Clara said. They sat with that understanding for a moment. Then something came through the kitchen window, faint from the direction of the south pasture, not quite a sound, but the absence of the usual sounds, and both of them were on their feet before they had consciously decided to move. They went outside. Ranger was at the north fence. Not patrolling. Not watching. Standing with a rigidity that Clara had not seen in him before, every muscle locked, his attention fixed on the northern ridge with an intensity that was almost human. Belle had moved the horses into a loose cluster near the south fence. The cattle in the adjacent pen were pressed together in the corner furthest from the north fence. Clara looked at the ridge. She looked at Ethan. "That's not a coyote pack," Ethan said quietly. "No," Clara said. Because coyotes moved in the hours after dark, not in the late afternoon. And Ranger's reaction to coyotes was different from this. It was alert and directed, purposeful. What she was seeing now was something that looked in the set of his body and the lock of his attention more like dread. "Someone's up there," Clara said. Ethan looked at the ridge for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Watching us." Yes. She thought about Nathan Caldwell driving away an hour ago. She thought about his expiring patience and his new calculation. "How long do you think they've been there?" she said. "Long enough," Ethan said. He said it quietly, without drama, the way he said most things. But in the context of everything they had just said in the kitchen, in the context of Nathan Caldwell's visit and the water rights letter and the 3 months left on the banknote, those 2 words landed with a weight that Clara felt in her chest. Long enough. Long enough to know about the horses. Long enough to know about Samuel Grant and the letter she'd sent to Helena. Long enough to know that the strategy Nathan Caldwell had been building for months was running up against something he hadn't accounted for. She looked at Ranger standing at that fence, vibrating with the certainty of what he knew. And she understood with a clarity that felt like cold water on her face that the next thing Nathan Caldwell did would not be polite. He had been patient for months. He had been methodical and careful and invisible. But she had called him out on her porch that afternoon, named what he was doing, refused him for the last time, and sent him away without his purchase. Patience had a floor, and Nathan Caldwell had just hit it. The fire started at 2 in the morning. She woke to Ranger screaming. She had not known horses could make that sound, not in any distress she had witnessed before. It was not a whinny or a squeal or any of the sounds she had come to know from years of working with animals. It was something more elemental than that, a sound that went directly past her brain and into her nervous system and had her on her feet and at the window before she was fully conscious. The supply barn was burning, not starting to burn. Burning. The kind of fire that has been going long enough to have made up its mind, orange light, throwing itself against the dark with an enthusiasm that meant it was past the point of stopping with water and buckets. She pulled on boots and coat and ran. Ethan was already outside when she came through the door, and the ranch hand Wes was coming from the bunkhouse at a dead run, and all 3 of them looked at the barn and made the same calculation simultaneously and wordlessly. The barn was lost. "The horses," Clara said. "Already clear," Ethan said. "Ranger." He stopped. "Ranger woke them. I don't know how. I came out and they were already at the far fence." She looked at the horses, clustered at the south fence line. All 7 of them, watching the fire with the focused attention they brought to everything. Not panicked. Watching. She looked at the barn. She thought about what was in it. Feed. Equipment. The reserve hay that had to last through winter. Tools she could not afford to replace. She thought about Nathan Caldwell driving away in the afternoon. She thought about the man on the ridge. She didn't say any of it out loud. She stood in the orange light, and she watched her supply barn burn, and she felt the grief and the rage come up through her in a single wave that she rode without letting it break her. Wes said, "What do you want us to do?" "Wet down the fence line between the barn and the house," Clara said. "Keep it from spreading. There's nothing to do about the barn itself." Her voice came out level, which surprised her slightly. They wet down the fence line. The barn burned. By the time the sky started to go gray in the east, there was nothing left but the stone foundation and the smell of it, and Clara sat on the fence rail and looked at what had been 3 months of winter feed supply, and felt the numbers adjusting in her head in a way she did not like. Ethan came and stood beside her. "It was set," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "I found a boot print near the east corner," he said. "Fresh. Someone was there within the last 4 hours." She nodded. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. His face in the gray early light was very serious, and something in it made her pay attention in a different way than usual. "I need you to hear something," he said. "What happened tonight, this is not a man who's still trying to pressure you. A man applying pressure doesn't burn your barn. He has someone do something recoverable, something deniable. A man burns a barn when he's decided the pressure isn't working and he wants you frightened. I know, she said. You're not frightened, he said. And it wasn't a compliment exactly or a challenge. It was an observation, and it had a question underneath it. I'm terrified, Clara said. I'm just not letting it make my decisions for me. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then we need to move faster than we planned, he said. Grant needs to be here before Caldwell's next move. And whatever his next move is, it won't wait much longer. Clara looked at the ruins of the barn. She looked at the horses at the south fence. Ranger standing at the outside edge of the group, watching not the fire, but the ridge, still watching the ridge, as though the thing up there had never left. Maybe it hadn't. She got down from the fence. Write a second letter to Grant, she said. Tell him what happened tonight. Tell him to come now. She went inside to make coffee, and behind her, the gray dawn came up over Whitmore Flats, and the smoke from the barn rose straight into the still air, and somewhere above the ridge, the thing that had been watching turned away and went back to report what it had seen. Samuel Grant arrived on a Thursday, 6 days after Clara sent the second letter. She knew he was coming before she saw him, because Ranger turned away from the ridge for the first time in 3 days, and looked south down the road instead, and she had learned by now to trust what that horse's attention told her. She was on the porch when the rider came through the gate, and she recognized Grant before she could make out his face, the way he sat a horse upright and economical, the posture of a man who had spent 30 years on horseback and had made his peace with it. Samuel Grant was 55 years old and looked like someone had carved him out of the same material as the territory itself, weathered angular, with eyes that had the particular quality of a man who had seen a great deal and had learned to look at things directly rather than around them. He had known Thomas for 11 years. He had written Clara a letter after the burial that said in its entirety, Thomas Whitmore was a man of uncommon sense and uncommon decency, and I am poorer for his absence. If there is ever a thing I can do, I mean that without reservation. She had held on to that letter. He got down from his horse and took her hand in both of his, and what he said was, I came as fast as I could. Tell me everything. She told him everything. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, she and Ethan and Grant, and she laid it out from the beginning, the auction, the horses, Ethan's arrival, the first Coyote attack, the Heller Ranch, the water rights filing, Nathan's visit the barn. She put Thomas's survey documents on the table. She put the county filing on the table. She put the letter from the bank on the table, and then she described the boot print near the east corner of what used to be her supply barn, and the smoke that was still faintly visible when Grant had ridden in. Grant listened, the way Ethan listened completely, without the need to fill the spaces. When she was finished, he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table, looking at the documents. The survey challenge is fraudulent, he said. It wasn't a question. The original documents support our boundary, Ethan said. Every one of them. Grant picked up Thomas's 1873 survey record and read it carefully. Clara watched his face. She had learned to read men's faces during the past 3 months in ways she hadn't needed to before. And what she read in Grant's face was something that moved from assessment into something colder and more purposeful. Who filed the counter-survey? He asked. A man named Reese, Clara said. He's a surveyor out of Billings. I asked around. He's done work for Caldwell's operation before. Grant set the paper down. Clara, he said, I need to be straight with you about something. What I can do officially as a territorial inspector has limits. Land disputes go through the county land office, and if that office has been influenced, the official process could take longer than your banknote allows. He paused. But there's an unofficial channel that sometimes moves faster. What channel? She asked. I know the territorial land commissioner in Helena, Grant said. Personally, we served together in the war, which is a different kind of knowing. He's a man who does not respond well to being told that someone is manipulating his county land offices. He looked at her steadily. If I write to him tonight and send it by the morning rider, you could have a territorial review of the survey claim within 2 weeks. That's faster than the county process. And at the territorial level, Caldwell's county connections don't reach. 2 weeks, Clara said. Maybe 10 days, Grant said. James moves fast when he's angry, and this will make him angry. Clara looked at Ethan. He gave her the small nod that meant he'd already considered it, and it was sound. Write the letter, she said. Grant wrote it that night at Thomas's desk, and Clara stood in the doorway watching him, and felt something Thomas shaped in the room with them, the sense of a man who had done his work at that desk, and had left behind in the wood of it and the lamp above it something of himself that hadn't entirely dissipated. She went to bed at 11 with a feeling she could not entirely name. It wasn't optimism exactly. It was the feeling of having placed a bet on the right number after a long time of not being certain any number was right. She slept hard, which she hadn't done since before the fire. In the morning, Grant went to see the horses. She had expected politeness from him, the respectful attention of a man humoring something he wasn't sure about yet. What she got instead was Grant standing at the south pasture fence for 35 minutes in absolute silence, watching Ethan move the horses through their paces, and at the end of 35 minutes, he turned to Clara with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "How long has this been developing?" he asked. "Since the day I brought them home," Clara said. "Ethan organized it, but the structure was already in them." Grant looked back at the horses. Belle was moving through the small cattle herd Clara kept in the adjacent pen, and the cattle were doing something that Clara had never been able to adequately describe to anyone who hadn't seen it. They were calm. Not resigned, not simply confined. Calm in the particular way of animals that have made a decision about the reliability of their situation. "I've been in livestock inspection for 12 years, Grant said. "I have never seen anything like this." "Nobody has," Ethan said, coming to the fence, "because the people who developed it weren't writing papers." "These horses came through the Fort Benton remount evaluation," Grant said. "They were rejected," Ethan said. "I was there. I filed an objection to the rejection of the stallion and the 2 mares. The objection was noted and disregarded." Grant looked at him. "You were cavalry." 12 years, Ethan said. "The last 3 as a trainer." "Why did you leave?" Something moved through Ethan's face. Not evasion exactly, but the careful navigation of a true thing that had complicated edges. "Because I kept disagreeing with the methodology," he said. "And there's a limit to how many times a man can disagree before he becomes more trouble than he's worth to an organization." Grant studied him for a moment with those direct eyes. Then he said, "I want to be here when the next Coyote pack comes." He didn't have to wait long. The attack came Saturday night, and it was the largest Clara had seen. She counted later in the light of the following morning and arrived at something between 50 and 60 animals, a number that made even Grant, who had seen a great many things in 30 years across the territory, go very quiet when she told him. They had all been outside since midnight. Ranger had begun his locked north fence attention at 10 o'clock, and Clara had woken Ethan and Grant and Wes and the 2 other hands, and they had all taken positions along the fence line because Ethan had said 3 days earlier that the next attack would come with more animals than before. He had said it quietly and without elaboration, and she had believed him without knowing exactly why, and she had been right to believe him. The pack came from the north and east simultaneously, and it came fast, none of the testing approach of the previous attacks. This was committed, which meant something had changed. Either the pack was growing desperate as the easy ranch targets dried up, or something had driven them south with more urgency than before. The horses were already in position when the first animals cleared the ridge. Clara stood at the fence beside Grant, and she watched Ranger go to the threat with the same locked certainty he always carried. And she heard Grant beside her draw a breath and hold it. Belle had the cattle tight, and the horses formed the arc around them, and the pack hit the line, and the line held, and what happened in the next 40 minutes was something Clara would spend years trying to find words for, and never entirely succeed. The horses fought. Not in the frantic, panicked way of animals trying to escape something. In the deliberate, coordinated way of animals that have decided where the line is and are committed to maintaining it. Ranger drove attacks back again and again, and the horses beside him held their positions, and the pack tested every section of the arc, and found every section held, and the cattle behind Belle were still. Wes, beside Clara, said under his breath, "I have never in my life." "No," Clara said, "neither have I." At some point during the third wave, Grant said very quietly, "Write your report yourself, Clara. I'll sign it and file it as an official territorial inspector's observation, but write it in your words because your words are better than mine for what this is." She looked at him. "I mean it," he said without taking his eyes off the horses. The pack withdrew before 3 in the morning. The cattle were unharmed. The horses were tired, she could see it in them. The post-battle looseness of animals that have pushed themselves hard, but they were uninjured, and Belle moved through the herd with the satisfied deliberateness of an animal that has completed a thing she set out to do. Clara put her hands on the top fence board and breathed. Grant said, "Nathan Caldwell is about to make the worst mistake of his life." She looked at him. "He's been trying to take a ranch," Grant said. "He doesn't understand that he's been trying to take something that's going to become the most valuable piece of knowledge in the Montana Territory within the year." He turned to look at her directly. "When word of tonight spreads, and it will spread, because Wes will tell someone, and that someone will tell someone, every rancher who's losing cattle to this coyote crisis is going to come to you. Not to me, not to the county agent, to you. And whatever price Caldwell was planning to offer for your land is going to look like an insult within the month." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't solve the banknote," she said. "No," Grant said. "But I have a thought about that, if you're willing to hear it." She was willing. What Grant proposed was careful and legitimate, and was in fact something Thomas would have thought of if he'd had more time. The ranchers who were suffering cattle losses from the coyote crisis, and there were now 11 documented operations within 40 miles of Whitmore Flats that were taking serious losses, had a collective problem that the county had no effective answer for. If those ranchers were willing to formalize an arrangement with Clara to pay a consultation fee for the use of her horses and Ethan's expertise, the income could address the banknote and establish Whitmore Flats as something more than a surviving ranch. Something permanent. A cooperative, Clara said. "Of a kind," Grant said. "You'd need the ranchers to agree. Some of them will because they've already seen what your horses can do, or they've heard from Frank Heller. Others will need convincing." "Let me talk to Frank," Clara said. Frank Heller, when she rode to his place Monday morning and laid it out, didn't need convincing at all. "I've been waiting for you to ask," he said. She looked at him. "You knew I'd ask." "I knew you'd come up with something," he said. "I was just waiting to see what shape it took." He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "How many ranchers do you need?" 6 committed to start, she said. "Enough to show the bank its viable income." "I can get you 6 by Wednesday," Frank said. "Anderson will come. The Morrison outfit will come. Jim Pierce, up near the creek, has been losing cattle for 2 months and is desperate enough to try anything. He'll definitely come. You want me to contact them?" "Please," Clara said. Frank stood up and put his hat on, which was his version of committing to a course of action. "Clara," he said, "I want you to know something. I've been ranching this county for 40 years. I've watched a lot of people come and go, and I've watched a lot of people get pushed out by men with more money and better connections and no particular conscience. I didn't stop any of it. I kept my head down and minded my own operation, and told myself it wasn't my business." He stopped and looked at her with those 40 years' eyes. "It was my business. It's always been my business. I'm sorry it took me this long to remember that." Clara looked at him. "Thank you, Frank," she said. It was the only thing she said, but he understood everything she meant by it. She rode home and found Ethan at the north fence with Ranger, and there was something in the way both of them were standing the man and the horse that made her rein in and look at them more carefully. "What is it?" she called. Ethan turned. "Come see this," he said. She tied her horse and went to the fence, and he showed her the ground on the north side of the fence line. She saw it immediately, not a boot print this time, but the signs of a deliberate survey. Stake holes in the ground. The kind made by a surveyor's equipment driven into the soil and then pulled out, but leaving behind the unmistakable circular depressions that she recognized from the times Thomas had had the fence lines resurveyed. "Someone was measuring," she said. "Last night or the night before," Ethan said, "while we were busy with the coyotes." She stood with that for a moment. While they were occupied on the south side, while the attack was happening, and every person on the ranch was at the south fence watching the horses hold the line, someone had been on the north side of the property measuring her land. "He sent men during the attack," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "He knew the attack was coming," she said. Ethan looked at her. "Ethan," she said slowly, "the coyote pack that came Saturday, 50 or 60 animals, larger than anything that's hit any ranch in the county, coming from the north the same direction." She stopped. "Someone drove them here." The silence that followed that statement was the kind that happens when two people reach the same conclusion at the same moment, and neither of them wants to be the first one to say it out loud, because saying it out loud makes it real. "He's been driving the packs," Ethan said. "Not all of them," Clara said, thinking it through. "The early attacks were natural. The crisis is real. The packs are genuinely moving south. But the timing, the size, the direction..." She looked at the stake holes. "He's been using the coyote crisis, channeling it, maybe paying men to push the packs toward the ranches he wants destabilized, while offering to buy those ranches," Ethan said. "The Morrison place sold 2 weeks ago," Clara said. Her voice came out flat. "Sold to a buyer out of Helena. Nobody local. I heard about it and thought nothing of it." She paused. "How much do you want to bet that buyer has a connection to Caldwell?" Ethan said nothing because there was nothing to say. The shape of it was too clear now. Nathan Caldwell hadn't just been waiting for Thomas to die. He had been constructing a crisis, slowly and patiently, using the real instability of the coyote situation as cover for something much more deliberate. Every ranch that sold under pressure sold to buyers who, when you looked long enough, connected back to him. Every ranch that couldn't hold on became his at a fraction of its value. And he had driven the largest pack of the season directly at Whitmore Flats on the same night he sent surveyors to measure her northern boundary. He had expected the attack to break her. Instead, her horses had held the line Grant had witnessed it, and now he had surveyors' marks in the ground that she could show anyone who came to look. "Grant needs to see this," Clara said. Grant came to the fence and looked at the stake holes and said nothing for 30 seconds. Then he said, "I'm going to need to make some additional inquiries into the Morrison sale." "How long?" Clara asked. "A few days," he said. "I have contacts in Helena who track land transfers. If the buyer connects to Caldwell, we'll know." He paused. "Clara, if that connection exists, this isn't a property dispute anymore. This is fraud. Potentially criminal fraud, if we can show the coyote herding was deliberate." "Can we show it?" she asked. "That depends on whether anyone he paid to do the herding is willing to talk," Grant said. "Men who are hired for something like that usually have a reason to stay quiet. But men who are hired for something like that also frequently resent having been put at risk for someone else's profit." He looked at her. "It only takes one." Clara thought about Doyle, who had ridden past her fence with that verdict smile, and who had looked underneath the smile like a man performing a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "I might know where to start," she said. She didn't go to Doyle herself. That was Ethan's counsel, and she took it. A widow approaching one of Caldwell's men would be read as desperation, and desperation invited contempt. Instead, she sent Frank Heller, because Frank was the kind of man that other men in this county told things to, not because he pressed, but because he was there and he listened, and he had been a known quantity for 40 years. Frank came back on Wednesday with information that made Clara sit down. Doyle had not driven the coyotes, but he knew who had 2 brothers named Croft, who ran a trap line north of the county, and who had been paid 3 separate times over the past 4 months to push coyote packs toward specific properties at specific times. Doyle had known about it. He had not participated, but he had known, and he had kept that knowledge because he had believed Nathan Caldwell was untouchable, and that knowledge of his crimes was more dangerous to hold than ignorance. "What changed?" Clara asked. Frank's expression told her something had shifted before he spoke. "His boy," he said. "Doyle's youngest. 12 years old, working on the Morrison place for summer wages. When the Morrison family sold and left the new operation, let the boy go. No severance, no nothing. Just go home." Frank paused. Doyle is a man who has made his peace with a lot of things. He hadn't made peace with that. Clara was quiet. "He'll talk to Grant?" she asked. "He'll talk to Grant," Frank said. "Not in writing, not yet. But he'll tell him enough to find the Croft brothers, and the Croft brothers are a different story." Grant found the Croft brothers on Friday. She didn't know exactly what he said to them, and she didn't ask because Grant was a man who knew how to have conversations that moved things without leaving marks, and she trusted him to move this the right way. What she knew was that by Friday evening, Grant came back to Whitmore Flats with a written statement from the elder Croft brother and a face that looked like a man carrying something heavy and finally putting it down. "James confirmed the Morrison buyer," Grant said, setting his hat on the table. "Third-party company out of Helena. The principal investor is listed as a land development concern registered in 1879. The registered agent is the wife of Nathan Caldwell's attorney." Clara put her hands flat on the table. "He's been building this for years," she said. "At least 4, Grant said. "The development concern predates the Coyote crisis. He was already acquiring land through front companies before the crisis gave him cover to accelerate. The full scale of it sat in the room between them like a third person." "Samuel," Clara said. "What happens now?" "Now," Grant said, "I write a report. An official territorial inspector's report, citing the survey fraud, the Morrison land transfer, the Croft brothers' statement, and my personal observation of the incident at your south pasture last Saturday. That report goes to the territorial commissioner, who, as I mentioned, is a man who does not respond well to being made a fool of in his own territory. And James, when he receives it, will have the authority to freeze the county land office proceedings on the water rights challenge pending investigation." He paused. "That buys you time." "How much time?" "Enough," Grant said. "And if the investigation goes where I think it's going, it buys you considerably more than time." She absorbed that. Then the door opened and Ethan came in, and he was moving with the particular speed that meant something had happened outside, and Clara was on her feet before he spoke. "3 men on the north fence," he said. "Not surveyors. They've got the look of men who were sent to do something, not measure something." Grant stood up. "Caldwell knows," Clara said. "He must have heard about Doyle," Ethan said. "Or the Croft brothers. Or both." Grant put his hand on the rifle he had leaned against the wall when he came in. "How many men do you have on the property tonight?" "Wes and 2 others," Clara said. "Plus the 3 of us." "That's 6, Grant said. "And 7 horses," Ethan said. Clara looked at Ranger through the window. He was at the north fence, already standing between the 3 men and the rest of the property, and she had come far enough in these months to understand that Ranger standing at that fence was not simply an animal being territorial. It was a declaration. "We don't move," Clara said. "We stand our ground. They're here to frighten us into making a mistake, and we are not going to make a mistake." She looked at Ethan, and then at Grant. "Ethan, go to the south pasture and bring the horses to the north fence, not to drive those men away. Just so that when those men look at this property, they understand what they're looking at." Ethan went. Grant looked at her. "You're not frightened," he said. "I'm terrified," she said, exactly as she had said it to Ethan weeks ago. "But this is my ranch, and those are my horses, and I am done with the business of being frightened into giving up what's mine." She walked out to the porch. The 3 men at the north fence looked at her. In the low evening light, she could not make out their faces, but she could see the shape of their intention clearly enough. She stood on the porch and did nothing and said nothing, and simply stood there the way Belle stood at the center of the herd, not retreating, not advancing, simply being exactly where she was, making it absolutely clear that this was where she intended to remain. Behind her, she heard Grant come to the doorway. Wes and the other hands came from the south. And then she heard Ethan. And behind him, the sound of 7 horses, moving at a walk toward the north fence. Not running, not panicking, just moving with the same deliberate calm purpose they brought to everything. The 3 men at the fence watched the horses come. And then, without a word that carried across the distance, they mounted up and rode north. She stood on the porch and watched them go until they were out of sight, and she let out a breath that she felt had been building in her chest for 3 months. Ethan came to stand beside her. "They'll report back," he said. "I know," she said. "This isn't over." "No," she said. "But look." She nodded toward the north fence, where Ranger stood watching the ridge. And for the first time since the first morning she had brought him home, the stallion's posture had changed. Not the locked attention, the rigid certainty of imminent threat. Something looser. Something that looked in the long evening light almost like waiting rather than watching. Like whatever had been on that ridge had finally moved on. She didn't know how much time she had. She didn't know what Nathan Caldwell would do next, or how fast Grant's commissioner friend moved, or whether the Croft brothers' statement would hold up under the pressure that Caldwell's attorney would apply to it. She didn't know any of the things she needed to know to feel entirely safe. But she knew her horses were at the fence. She knew Samuel Grant was in her kitchen, writing a report that would reach the territorial commissioner in Helena within the week. She knew Frank Heller had 6 ranchers ready to sign a cooperative agreement that would turn Whitmore Flats from a struggling operation into something with a future. And she knew with the particular certainty that comes not from having all the answers, but from having done the work and stood the ground, that what Nathan Caldwell had been trying to take was not just a piece of land with water rights attached. He had been trying to take a woman who had buried her husband and bought 7 unwanted horses and refused, in the face of every pressure he could bring to bear, to become the person he had decided she was supposed to be. And that was the one thing Clara Whitmore had discovered over the past 3 months that Nathan Caldwell absolutely did not know how to take. Because it wasn't for sale. It never had been. The territorial commissioner's response came 9 days after Grant sent the report. Clara was in the barn with Ethan when Wes came running from the gate with the envelope, and she knew from the way Wes was moving, that particular loose-limbed run of someone carrying good news, they can't wait to deliver, that whatever was inside it was not bad. She took the envelope from him and opened it, standing right there in the barn doorway, and she read it once quickly and then a second time slowly, the way she read important things to make sure she had the shape of it right. She handed it to Ethan without a word. He read it. His face did the thing it rarely did. It moved fully, and without the usual careful control, into something that looked like relief. "The survey challenge is frozen," he said. "Pending full territorial investigation," Clara said. "Yes." "And the Morrison transfer?" "Under review," she said. "James Grant's commissioner has flagged 3 other land transfers in the county over the past 2 years for the same review. He believes they connect to the same development concern." Ethan set the letter down on the hay bale beside him and looked at her. "He's finished," Ethan said. Not with satisfaction exactly, with the tone of a man stating a fact that has been a long time arriving. "Not yet," Clara said. "But he will be." She went to find Grant, who was at the south fence watching Belle work the cattle with the focused attention of a man who has discovered something he cannot stop thinking about. She gave him the letter and watched him read it and watched his face do something quiet and satisfied. "James moves fast," he said. "You said he would." "I said it when I hoped it," Grant said. "It's different to see it." He folded the letter and handed it back. "There will be a formal hearing. The county land office, the survey challenge, the development concern, all of it will come out in a formal territorial hearing. Caldwell will have representation. It won't be immediate and it won't be painless." He looked at her steadily. "But it will happen." "When?" she asked. 6 weeks, Grant said. "Maybe 8. James will set the date and notify all parties." He paused. "Clara, I need to ask you something. When that hearing happens, they'll want testimony. From you, from me, from the Croft brothers, from Doyle, if he's willing to move from verbal to written. It will be public. Everything you've been through, everything Caldwell did, it goes on record, in front of people." "Good," Clara said. Grant looked at her. "There are people in this county who've known Nathan Caldwell for 30 years, who've done business with him, who count him as a friend. Some of them are going to push back. Some of them are going to say you misread the situation, that you're a grieving widow who saw conspiracy where there was only business." "Let them say it," Clara said. "It won't be comfortable." "Samuel," she said, "comfortable is not the thing I've been aiming for." He almost smiled. It was the closest to a full smile she had seen from him. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it is." She told Ethan that evening, sitting on the porch in the cooling air, and he listened and was quiet for a moment after. 6 weeks, he said. Maybe 8. "The banknote comes due in 5, he said. She had been waiting for someone to say that. She had been saying it to herself for 3 days. "I know. The cooperative," he said. "How close is Frank to having the agreement signed?" 4 ranchers committed in writing, she said. "Anderson signed Monday. Frank, of course. Pierce signed yesterday. The Morrison place is under new ownership that we can't count on. But there are 2 others Frank is still talking to." 4 ranchers, Ethan said. What does that bring in against the note? She had done the arithmetic so many times she had it memorized. "Enough to make a partial payment," she said. "Enough to show the bank it's a viable operation with ongoing income. Whether Aldous Hitch considers that sufficient to extend the timeline." She stopped. "I need to talk to him directly." "When?" "Tomorrow," she said. She drove to Garrison the following morning and went to the bank before she did anything else. And she sat across from Aldous Hitch in his small, careful office, with its careful furniture and its air of decisions that had already been made. And she put the cooperative agreements on his desk, and she put Grant's letter on his desk, and she put a 1-page summary she had written herself the previous evening on his desk, and she folded her hands and waited. Aldous Hitch was a man who had grown up watching his father make decisions in this same office, and he carried the weight of that inheritance in the particular way that second-generation men carry things, with great seriousness and a slight but persistent terror of getting it wrong. Clara had always understood this about him, even when it frustrated her. He read everything she had put in front of him. He read it slowly, which she took as a good sign, because Aldous Hitch read fast when he had already decided, and slow when he was genuinely considering. When he was done, he set the papers straight on his desk with both hands and looked at her. "The cooperative income," he said. "You're confident in its continuity. The Coyote crisis is not going to resolve itself in 5 weeks, Clara said. The ranchers who have signed on are doing so because they have an ongoing problem, and they have seen with their own eyes that my horses provide an ongoing solution. Frank Heller will tell you that himself, if you want to hear it from him." "The territorial investigation," Aldous said. "If it resolves in your favor." "When it resolves in my favor," Clara said, "the water rights remain with this property, which means the land value is what it has always been, and more, because there are now income-generating operations attached to it that didn't exist before." Aldous looked at her for a moment. She watched him weighing things. "Clara," he said, "I want you to know that the letter I sent the language about welcoming a conversation about the property." "I know, Aldous," she said. "You were doing what the bank required you to do." "I want you to know I didn't enjoy it," he said. "I know that too," she said. "And I'm not here to make you feel bad about it. I'm here to ask you for 60 more days." He straightened the papers again, which was his version of working something out. 45, he said, "and I'll need a payment against the note by the 15th. "The 15th of next month," she said. Yes, she could make the 15th. Barely, but she could make it. "Done," she said. She shook his hand and walked out of the bank into the Garrison Street and stood there for a moment in the fall air, and she felt 45 days landing on her shoulders, and she decided to feel them as what they were, enough rather than what they weren't. She did 3 other things in Garrison that morning. She went to the land office and filed a formal notice citing Grant's letter and the territorial freeze that the water rights challenge was under review, and that no county-level action should proceed pending that review. The clerk took it with an expression that told her the clerk had already received a version of this from someone above him in the territorial chain and was not surprised to see her. She went to the feed store where Pitts met her with the genuine embarrassment of a man who had done something he was ashamed of and knew it, and she told him without anger and without warmth that she would be resuming her account on the usual terms and that she expected those terms to be honored. He agreed immediately. She bought what she needed and put it on the account and drove out. And then, on the way back through the main street, she passed Nathan Caldwell. He was coming out of the attorney's office. His attorney's office. The man whose wife's name was on the development concern's registration, and he saw her at the same moment she saw him. And they both stopped. His wagon and her wagon, 10 feet apart, in the middle of the street. And the whole visible width of what had happened between them in the past 3 months sitting in the air like weather. Nathan looked at her. He was still impeccably dressed, still carrying himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the largest gravity in any room. But something had changed in his face since the last time she had seen him on her porch. The patience was gone. What was there instead was the expression of a man who has realized, possibly for the first time in his life, that a thing is not going to go the way he planned it. He didn't speak first. She didn't expect him to. "Nathan," she said. "Clara." His voice was level, controlled. "I heard about the territorial freeze." "I thought you might," she said. "I want you to know," he said. And he started carefully, the way he always started carefully. "That whatever the investigation finds, my original offer for the property was—" "Nathan," she said. He stopped. "I'm not going to sell," she said. "I wasn't going to sell before the freeze. I'm not going to sell after the hearing. I am not going to sell this ranch. I need you to hear that as the final answer. It is, so we don't have to have this part of the conversation again." He looked at her for a long moment. "You understand," he said slowly, "that the hearing is going to be difficult. The things that come out—" "I know what's going to come out," Clara said. "I'm the one who put them in front of Samuel Grant." Something moved across Nathan Caldwell's face. Not anger quite. Something more complicated than anger. The expression of a man who has spent 30 years in a county being the person who made the moves, who decided the outcomes, who saw further ahead than everyone else, confronting the fact that someone had seen further than him. "You're a stubborn woman," he said. "I am," Clara agreed. She clicked to her horse and drove past him and didn't look back. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of November. The 6 weeks between the notice and the date were the hardest and the most alive that Clara could remember living since the spring before Thomas got sick the last spring, when everything was still possible and nothing had broken yet. They were hard because the cooperative demanded constant work, because the coyote attacks continued and the horses continued to answer them, because the ranch hands watched her for signs of cracking and she gave them none. They were alive because every morning she woke up to something that needed doing, and she did it, and every evening she looked at the south pasture, and the horses were there, and that had not lost its power to steady her even after months of it. Ethan was there through all of it, and she had stopped trying to define precisely what that meant. It meant what it meant, a man who arrived on her property because something had bothered him about a story he heard, who had stayed because the horses needed working, and then because the situation needed steadying, and then simply because he was there and the ranch had absorbed him the way good ground absorbs water without waste. She was aware that her feelings about him had become something she would eventually need to address. She was also aware that now was not the time, and he seemed to share that awareness because he had not pushed it toward anything definite, and she had not pushed it, and between them there was a kind of understanding that was wordless and sufficient. He found her at the north fence 3 nights before the hearing, standing where Ranger usually stood, looking at the ridge. "Can't sleep," he said. "I keep going over the testimony," she said. "What I'll say, what Caldwell's attorney will say back." "Grant has prepared you well," Ethan said. "Grant has prepared me practically," she said. "That's not quite the same as well." She looked at the ridge. I keep thinking about Thomas, about what he would say if he were here. Ethan was quiet beside her. He'd say you already know what to do, he said finally. He'd say you've known since the auction. She looked at him. You bought those horses because you understood something, Ethan said. Not the full shape of it, not all the details, but the core of it. You understood that what everyone else was throwing away still had value, and that the value was real even if nobody else could see it yet. That's what you're going to say at the hearing. Not legal arguments, that. She turned back to the ridge. Ranger was at the fence beside her, and he had been there since she came out, standing the way he always stood, not anxious, just present. Just there. She put her hand on his neck and felt the warmth of him, the solid living reality of him. And she thought about the auction yard, and the $12, and the laughter of the men at the rail, and Thomas who had believed. He was right, she said. He was, Ethan said. About the horses, she said. And about everything else. She felt Ethan look at her in the dark, and she let him look, and neither of them said anything else, and the night was quiet around Whitmore Flats, in the particular way it had gotten quiet in recent weeks. Not the silence of something waiting to happen, but the silence of something that had settled. The hearing was held in the Garrison County Assembly Room on a Tuesday morning in November, and it was the most crowded that room had been since the fire that had taken the Morrison barn 6 years ago, and the whole county had shown up to organize the rebuild. Clara came in with Grant on one side and Frank Heller on the other, and she did not look at Nathan Caldwell's table when she passed it, and she sat down and put her hands in her lap and breathed. The territorial commissioner's representative was a man named Abbott, who was 38 years old and had the clipped precision of someone who did this for a living and had learned to move proceedings efficiently without losing their substance. He opened by outlining what was under review: the survey challenge, the land transfers, the arson investigation that had been opened after Grant's report flagged the barn fire, the Croft brothers' statements, Doyle's verbal account now formalized in writing. Clara heard Nathan Caldwell's attorney object to the framing within the first 5 minutes. Abbott sustained one objection and overruled 2 others which told her something useful about Abbott. Frank Heller testified first because Grant had decided that starting with a 63-year-old rancher who had been in this county longer than most of the people in the room were alive would set a tone that was harder to dismiss. Frank testified in the flat, direct way he did everything, what he had seen at his ranch, what the horses had done, what the coyote attacks had looked like before and after. He was not dramatic about it. He didn't need to be. The facts were dramatic on their own. Caldwell's attorney tried to frame the cooperative arrangement as a commercial scheme that Clara had constructed specifically to manipulate the banknote situation. Frank looked at the attorney with 40 years of accumulated patience. "Son," he said, "I've been losing cattle for 8 months. I didn't sign on to a cooperative because Clara Whitmore needed my money. I signed on because her horses saved my herd, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise." The attorney tried 2 more approaches, and Frank answered them both the same way, plainly, without defensiveness, with the immovable certainty of a man reporting what he had seen with his own eyes. The attorney moved on. Grant testified about the survey documents, about the Morrison transfer, about the development concerns registration, about the connection to Caldwell's attorney's wife. He was precise and he was thorough, and he had documents for everything, because Samuel Grant had learned 30 years ago that the difference between a claim and a fact was usually a piece of paper. The Croft brothers' statements were read into the record. Doyle's written account was read into the record. Clara watched Nathan Caldwell's face during both readings and saw something she had not expected to see. Not defiance, not calculation. Something that looked for a moment almost like exhaustion. Like a man who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and has in this room finally been asked to set it down in front of people. Then it was Clara's turn. She stood up and walked to the front of the room, and she was aware of every person in that assembly. The ranchers who had mocked her at the auction, the men who had stood in her yard after Thomas's burial and waited for her to fail. Frank Heller with his arms crossed and his jaw set, Ethan against the back wall with the stillness that was his version of solidarity. She was aware of all of it, and she stood at the front of the room, and she thought of what Ethan had said at the fence 3 nights ago. not legal arguments. That. She told them about the auction. She told them about Thomas and what he had believed about the horses and why he had believed it. She told them about $12 and 7 rejected animals and the laughter of the men at the rail, and she told them what she had understood in the moment she decided to bid, not everything, not the full shape of it, but the core that value is not determined by the people who are too busy to look. She told them about the first Coyote attack and what the horses did and what it meant. She told them about Frank Heller coming to her gate and the Heller Ranch and the 6 men watching at the fence at sunrise. She told them about the barn fire and what she had felt standing in the orange light watching 3 months of winter feed turn to ash, and she told them that what she had felt was not defeat. She told them about the stake holes in the north fence line and what they had told her about the timing of the attack. She told them about Nathan Caldwell coming to her porch with his hat in his hands and his patience wearing thin. She said, "He told me that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do for themselves is recognize when they're fighting a battle they can't win. And I want to be clear about something. He was right that I should recognize that. He was wrong about which one of us was in that battle." The room was quiet. She said, "My husband believed that the things people throw away are sometimes exactly the things that save you. He believed it about horses, and I believe he believed it about people too. I am standing here because I was willing to see what 7 animals were worth when nobody else was looking. And I am asking this hearing to see what this land is worth, what this ranch is worth, when someone with enough money has been working very hard to make you look the other way." She sat down. The room stayed quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Frank Heller uncrossed his arms and put both hands on his knees and nodded once the way. Frank Heller nodded when something was settled, and the man beside him did the same, and Clara looked at her hands in her lap and breathed. Abbott called a recess. In the hallway, Ethan came to her, and Grant came to her, and Frank came to her, and what Frank said was, "Thomas would have liked that." And what Grant said was, "That was exactly right." And what Ethan said was nothing at all, because he put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and that was sufficient. Caldwell's attorney made his case after the recess. He was skilled, and he was thorough, and he constructed the most favorable possible version of events, business decisions made in good faith, a survey discrepancy identified through routine process land acquisitions that were legal and above board, a woman who had suffered a loss and was seeing patterns where there were only coincidences. He was persuasive in the way that skilled attorneys are persuasive by making the complex seem simple and the deliberate seem accidental. Abbott listened to all of it with the expression of a man who is counting something behind his eyes. Then Abbott called Nathan Caldwell himself. Nathan testified for 40 minutes. He was composed and articulate, and he maintained to the end the register of a man who genuinely could not understand why his reasonable business practices had been so badly mischaracterized. He was so consistent in this register that Clara, listening, felt a brief and disorienting moment of doubt. The doubt that comes when a story is told well enough to make you question your own memory. Then Abbott asked him a single question. He asked, when did Nathan Caldwell first become aware of the survey discrepancy in the Whitmore Flats eastern boundary? Nathan said when it was brought to his attention by the county assessor's office in September. Abbott took a paper from the file in front of him and read without inflection the date on which the development concern had commissioned its own private survey of the Whitmore Flats eastern boundary. March of 1881. 4 months before Thomas Whitmore died. The assembly room went very quiet. Nathan Caldwell's attorney said something that Abbott overruled before it was finished. Nathan Caldwell sat in the witness chair, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, he had nothing to say. His face did not collapse. It was not the collapse of a man exposed. It was something more complicated than that, the stillness of a man who has been running a very long race and has just in public run out of road. Clara looked at him. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel something like triumph, some clean, bright satisfaction, and instead what she felt was something older and less comfortable. She felt the weight of what it had cost. The barn, the sleepless months. Thomas's grave and the $12, and the men laughing at the auction rail. The weight of being the person who sees something that needs seeing and has to carry that sight alone until enough other people are willing to open their eyes. She felt all of that, and she sat with it, and she did not look away from Nathan Caldwell until he looked away first. The ruling came 3 days later. The water rights challenge was dismissed with prejudice. The survey filed by Reese was invalidated. The development concern was referred to the Territorial Attorney General for investigation of fraudulent land acquisition across 4 county properties. The arson investigation remained open with new evidence submitted. The Croft brothers had in the end provided information about a third party who had been present the night of the fire, and that third party had a documented employment relationship with Caldwell's operation. Aldous Hitch received a copy of the ruling and contacted Clara that same afternoon. He told her with the careful relief of a man who has been wanting to say something for months and finally has permission that the bank would extend the note on modified terms reflecting the cooperative income and the restored land value. She paid a third of the note outright from the cooperative payments that had accumulated. She kept the rest in the bank. The day after the ruling, she went to the south pasture at dawn and stood at the fence and looked at her horses in the early light, all 7 of them. The scarred black stallion who watched the ridge, and the old dun mare who held the center, and the 5 in between who had decided on whatever terms horses decide things that this was where they belonged. She thought about the auction yard, the $12, the laughter. She thought about Thomas, who had given her the tools to understand what she was buying and had not lived long enough to see her use them. She thought about Ethan, who was coming across the yard toward her right now with 2 cups of coffee. His boots quiet on the cold ground, his face carrying the unhurried look of a man who has decided where he intends to be. He came to the fence and handed her the cup and stood beside her. "It's done," he said. "Almost," she said. "What's left?" She looked at Ranger, who was standing at the north fence in the early light, but differently than before. Not locked, not rigid, just standing, just present. The way you stand when the thing you've been watching for has finally resolved into something you can name. "I want to rebuild the supply barn before winter," she said. "Stone this time, not timber. I want the cooperative formally documented before the end of the year. I want to write to 3 other ranchers east of the county line who've been asking Frank about the horses." She paused. "And I want to plant grass on the south field in the spring." Thomas had plans for that field that he never got to. Ethan was quiet for a moment, looking at the horses. "That's a lot of work," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "For one person," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the horses, not at her, but there was something in the set of his face that was very deliberate, very careful in the way of a man who is saying something important while appearing to say something simple. "It is," she said, "for one person." He turned then and looked at her, and in the early morning light of Whitmore Flats, with the coffee warm in her hands, and the horses at the fence, and the smoke not rising from any barn, and the ridge quiet, and the long grass moving in the first cold breath of winter, she saw in his face the thing she had been seeing for months and not naming. She named it now, at least to herself. "Ethan," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and the ghost of the almost smile was there. "You've been here 3 months, she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You could have left after the hearing," she said. "After the ruling." "I could have," he agreed. "But you didn't," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." She looked back at the horses. Ranger had moved from the north fence to the center of the pasture, which she had never seen him do at dawn before. He stood in the pale morning light with Belle beside him, and the other horses around them, and the whole arrangement had the quality of something that has found after a long time in motion its natural resting place. She thought about Thomas leaving her a box of papers, and a man's belief in 7 horses, and the certainty that what the world threw away was worth retrieving. She thought about what it meant to build something that lasted. "Stay," she said. It was one word. Ethan Walker looked at her for a moment in the early morning quiet of the ranch that she had refused to lose, and then he turned back to the horses, and he said very simply, "Yes, ma'am." The winter came in hard, the way Montana winters do, fast and total, and without the courtesy of a warning, and Whitmore Flats held through it. The new stone barn held. The cooperative held. The horses held through 3 more coyote attacks over the course of the cold months, each one turned back the same way as the first. By spring, there were 14 ranchers in the cooperative. By the following autumn, there were 22. By the time Clara Whitmore's stone barn was 5 years old, ranchers were riding in from 2 territories east to ask about the horses that nobody wanted. Territorial inspectors came. Writers from the agricultural papers came. A man from Washington came which nobody had expected, and on a Thursday morning in the spring of the ranch's 6th year, without Thomas. Clara stood at the south pasture fence and watched Ethan work the newest generation ranger's offspring. 3 of them, carrying the same attentiveness in their posture, the same locked intelligence in their eyes, and she felt the weight of everything it had taken to arrive here. The $12, the laughter, the grave and the barn, and the 3 months of sleepless watching, and the hearing, and the single word she had said at dawn by the fence. Frank Heller had said at a cooperative gathering the previous fall that Clara Whitmore had built something that would outlast all of them. He had said it the way Frank said things plainly without sentiment as a statement of observed fact, and the ranchers around him had nodded the way people nod when they hear something true said plainly. She had not corrected him. She had not said Thomas built the foundation, and Ethan built the method, and the horses built the proof. She had not said I only refused to stop seeing what I'd already seen. She let Frank's words stand because they were also true. She had built something. From $12 and 7 rejected horses and 1 widow who would not be moved. She had built something that the people who threw those horses away, and the man who tried to take her land, and the county that laughed at the auction rail, had not believed was possible. And every morning when she came out to the south pasture fence, and the horses were there, older now, the originals, their lines continuing in the animals that moved around them, she thought about Thomas's voice, saying it the last spring of his life. Sometimes the thing everyone throws away is the thing that saves you. He had been right. He had been right about the horses. He had been right about her. And standing at the fence of Whitmore Flats with Ethan's hand beside hers on the top board, and the morning coming up gold over the Montana grassland, and Ranger's son at the north fence. Watching the ridge with his father's eyes, Clara Whitmore knew, with the absolute and unshakable certainty of a woman who had earned the right to know it, that the things worth keeping were exactly the things worth fighting for. Every single one of them.